So it's wonderful to welcome you to this book group on this amazing, I guess it's a 15th century text, isn't it, rather than a 14th century one, the Book of Margery Kempe. So this week we've been looking at the Proem, which is a kind of introduction, and then the first nine chapters. And so right as we're right at the beginning here, I want for us to have a little think about, well, what are we reading? What kind of book are we reading? Have we in front of us? We have this beautiful Oxford Classics, which just looks like any old normal book. But what is the medieval text that Anthony Ball has been working on? Well, those of you who came to the Julian online book group will automatically realize that this book is very different from Julian of Norwich, who consistently erases herself from the text and just wants her revelations to speak, and also her interpretation of over many years of how she understood those revelations. This is very much about Margery, and it's about her life. And in that sense, this really does read much more as an autobiography. Margery tells us right at the beginning, in the introduction, the Proem, that she didn't sit down and write everything chronologically, that she wrote it as it came to her. And so we get the sense that Margery is remembering. She's looking back a number of years later. She tells us that she didn't want to write it down immediately. She wanted to leave some space. So it's many years after, in her later life, I guess, she's looking back and talking about her life. So it's more like a memoir than it is an actual sitting down and giving you chronological order of this happened, this happened, this happened. It has been said that this is the first English autobiography. I suppose that we know and guess that there would be others, but we just don't know about them. But what I find really interesting is that scholarship has really gone into the issue of what do we have here and whose voice do we hear? So they see it very much as an autobiography, but also as Margery giving a kind of defense of her life, a justification right at the end of her life of actually the life that she has led, because it is an unusual life. She's not within an order. She's not an anchoress. She's not so much a hermit or someone like that, which women really wouldn't have done anyway. So she's not a nun. She's not an anchoress. And she leads this kind of lay life, which is very rooted in a kind of contemplative, visionary, sacrificial kind of way of life. So she's writing at the end of her life about justifying why she had this, why she has done what she has done. And we're going to see right from the beginning that there are people who don't agree with Margery, who think that she's making up her crying. She's making it all just for show, and they just think there's nothing authentic about her at all. So she's trying to convince those people that she is authentic. And there is a thread that runs through this, and we'll particularly see this when she goes to see Julian of Norwich. There's a thread that she's also trying to convince herself that her revelations, her visions were authentic, and that she did live an authentic Christian life, doing exactly as Christ had led her into. So she's full of doubts. Margery is full of doubts throughout her life. So I wonder if that also has an important element to her writing this. So it consists of three parts. The very first part is this sort of strange introduction, which is sort of it starts and then it starts again. So a kind of double introduction. And in that we hear very much how difficult it was for her to get a scribe to help her with this book. So right from the beginning, it's very clear that Margery hasn't written this. Okay, she hasn't read this. And it's also probable that she didn't know how to read. Later in the text, again, we're going to see Margery sitting with priests, being read to, telling us how she sat in a group, being read to and explained things and unfolded. So it's really likely that, unlike Julian, that she really couldn't read. And the jury's out with Julian about whether Julie could write, but it's certain that Margery really couldn't have written. So she needed what was known as amanuensis, which is someone to write down what she says. Now, this wasn't unusual for visionary writers, the most famous being Bridget of Sweden. She had an amanuensis. And what's clear in this is just how much of a role the priest is taking in Margery's text. We hear the language of the priest. We hear their interpretation. So we're getting Margery's voice very secondhand. And right from the beginning, we see this in that she's spoken to in the third person as this creature. Now, this is a bit of a humility topos. So using that as this creature, this person who is created by God and not, kind of on the spiritual, she's very much bodily kind of a person. So a recognition that she is of this world, of this fleshly world. And even in the chapters that we're looking at tonight, we see that this person, this very human person, is very open to all the temptations that arise from being embodied. So we have this third person, but what it does raise a unique sort of question about, so who actually is the author? Now, today we have very clear laws about, who is the author of the text, and you can't plagiarize, and you have to credit someone if you are using their words. But in the medieval period, that was much more meshed up. So author wasn't necessarily the person who actually wrote or the person who actually spoke. It was much to do with the production of a text, so that the scribes could be seen to have a form of authorship over Margery's Margery's text, as well as Margery herself. So we're not trying to get to the definitive words that Margery said. The priest is very much giving what they're hearing down on the text. So it's a combined way of creating a text. So the second book is very much the longest part, and it tells the account of her life. And it's this bit that's written by the second priest, who actually has to, as we hear, unpick, undecipher what the first priest scribe had written down and was nearly illegible. Really interesting. I'm sure you read in the notes that this text is dated to the 23rd of July, 1436. That's when the second priest actually starts compiling it, deciphering it, and continuing the book that the first one left hanging. So it dates from the 23rd of July, 1436, the day after the feast of Mary Magdalene. And actually, it's on the day of the feast of the death of Bridget of Sweden. Now, of course, it's very auspicious because Mary Magdalene, of course, is the great saint who, the great sinner saint who repents and then follows Jesus out of pure love for him. And then, of course, Bridget of Sweden, who is the epitome of the person who received visions. So they're locating this text, Margery and the priest, they're locating it within a structural frame of the penitent and the visionary. And I think you can see from these first 9 chapters that we're going to have the penitent Margery in the next few chapters. This is her story of her, initially, her story of her conversion of life to actually following Christ, to being like Bridget of Sweden, someone who receives visions. So she's aligning herself not only with the great sinner, but also she's aligning herself with the great visionary of the day, St. Bridget of Sweden. And then there's the final section, which is quite short, and it just is like an anthology of some of Margery's prayers. If we think about the manuscript, there's only one manuscript, and it's in the British Library. It's edition MS 61823. And actually, you can see it online because so many of the British Library manuscripts are now online for you to have a look at. And the edition that this edition is very much based upon that, but using the copy of the scribe called Solthaus, sometime in the 15th century. The actual original is lost, so we don't have the original, but we have this copy which was made later, and that's the one that's in the British Library. So we know that this manuscript, we know the kind of the provenance of this manuscript, because actually it was bound within a letter that came from Peter de Mont to William Bogey of Soham, dating to 1440. So that actually allows us to date this manuscript to 1440. It's a bit later, as I said, from 1436, when it was actually written, but not very much longer afterwards. And it's possible that he was a Benedictine monk at the priory of, oops, just let me get someone, at Norwich, which of course is now Norwich Cathedral. So it's very much from the East Anglia area, bit like Julian as well. And then from that, it made its way up to Mount Grace Priory, probably around the end of the 15th century. And it's from there that it was owned by Colonel Butler Bowden and found in a country house in Derbyshire in the early 1930s, and then identified as Margery's work by a person called Hope Emily Allen in 1934. And she was really instrumental in publishing one of the first modern scholarly editions of it. And then it wasn't until the 1980s that it was purchased by the British Library. It's really interesting because Hope Emily Allen was amongst a group of people. Grace Warwick was another one, and also I've forgotten her name, but there were a number of them around that time which sort of discovered these texts and actually made them accessible to people. It was a real flowering of making this late 14th century, early 15th century devotional writing accessible to people. If you go back to the Middle English, so Hope Emily Allen did a Middle English version, and then Barry Windiett, who we had for the Julian, also did a medieval edition in Middle English. You'll find that it's written in 15th century East Anglian prose, and actually I know a bit of Middle English, but it's really hard. It's really hard to read, and there are lots of kind of different words, and there's also lots of different use of of different letters, and their sentences are incredibly long with lots of subclauses. So it's really easy to get lost within the structure of the sentences. And you can see that subsequent scribes that possibly can identify 4 different hands that have gone through this manuscript, trying to make some kind of sense of it. There's one that actually writes in red, and that's sort of very noticeable, writing in the margins and giving illustrations. But what it does show is that the book was certainly used. It wasn't put in a closet somewhere. It was certainly used and valued by people, and that actually sections of the text were taken by people to help them in their spiritual life. So that's why in this way that this text, while it's quite different to some of the late 14th century devotional writings, is still seen to have those elements within it which really speak of the spiritual life at this period, and a depth of understanding and grappling with living out the Christian life in those times. So what about Margery? Well, it's good at this point to just kind of have a bit of a think about this person, Margery, particularly in these chapters from 1 to 9, because if you want to know what the medieval world kind of felt like and sounded like, then actually these chapters are really helpful in giving us a wonderful glimpse into the medieval world. Not only the thinking, but also the dress, also the lifestyle, and the devotional life. It's a fantastic sort of window into that period. Margery always reminds me a little bit of the wife of Bath, to be honest. There's something about her, that the vivacious character that's just, you know, bursting with kind of life, and yeah, pretty full on. So the section we've read tonight is about Margery's early life, and we get a lot of details about Margery's life, really kind of colourful insights, but also things that maybe we can relate to today. Right at the beginning, we hear about Margery and I suppose what we would describe as today as postnatal depression, and how she really descended into a kind of state of mental decline. And then she receives her first vision, but she keeps telling us that Christ is speaking to her in these periods, and then she will fall back. And she shows us that pretty much she commits all the sins in the book that you can possibly think of, from lechery to presumption to vanity, to all of them. I think that's quite interesting, because if you go to a number of these 14th century texts, I'm thinking particularly of Richard Rolle and Walter Hilton. They'll give you a section about the moral life, and they'll give you a section about how you can't start on the contemplative life until you've got your moral life a little bit under control. You need to live a good life, following the virtues, and then you can that's the kind of gateway, the doorway into the contemplative life. That may not be how we understand it today, because we all have the moral life to live and to get that balance. But in the medieval period, it was seen as sort of as more of a kind of stepping stone. And here we have Margery right at the beginning of her text, not talking about the moral life in a sort of educative way, no, this is what you need to do, teaching us. We have instead Margery showing us that this is how she lived the moral life, but also how she committed many of the sins that the moral life is concerned about, and also how much she was open to temptation. So she comes across as being an icon of the person who reforms their life to follow Christ. I find that quite interesting. And also it speaks of us to us in a very human level. We can at one and in our own way, we can certainly relate to what Margery is saying about being tempted and trying to think you're better than Christ, and why doesn't he love me enough, and all those kind of things. They're very human. She's very human. And we hear about how her business has failed. Oops, just letting 2 more people. Yeah. A couple of people having difficulty getting in tonight. Okay. And just for a bit of fun, I was thinking about, I was reading this bit about her clothing, Margery and her ostentatious clothing. And I was thinking, what are they talking about? So I did a little bit of research for you and for us. And let me just screen share for a moment. Where are we? There we are. So hopefully, okay. So it's this slide that I want to show you. I think I have to do a slideshow from the beginning. Okay. Okay. So this is the bit that interested me. I hope you can see that. Dagged with tippets. So I thought, what on earth is this term dagged? And I found, first of all, this very nice picture from the Mantra tapestry from Italy, and it's around exactly the same period that we're talking about with Margery. Now, the dagging, if you look at the lady on the far left, and her sleeves that are sort of dropping away in this amazing kind of manner, and it's all been cut and sliced. That's exactly what dagging means. Dagging is to have kind of frilly sort of sleeves. And they also did it on hoods. They had the bottom of the hood that came down from the neck and over the shoulders. That was very much what men did. Then also what came into fashion at this time was the horned headdress. This is from the Bedford Hours. It's the English. And I'm not so much looking at the lady in the front because that's Mary, but if you look at the ladies behind with their high headdresses. Now, what Margery is describing is a headdress similar to that, but she's got tippets, which is basically she's got like streamers that are coming out from the top, and there's strips of material, and often those strips of material go from the shoulder, but she's got them right up in her headdress. Hence, that's why her husband is saying you're a bit of a bit strange, Margery. And then finally, this you probably know Van der Weyden from Germany, again around this period, and there we have the slash sleeves that Margery is talking about. But Margery's saying is that she has multiple slashes. So you have different bits of material that's showing through. So we can already see that these are the fashions, the high fashions of the honourable ladies. But what Margery is describing is how she is really accentuating them into really high, nearly ludicrous kind of fashion. So I just wanted to show you that just because it's a bit of fun. Okay, I'll stop my sharing. So finally, just finally, right at the end, we can see that she has this vision of paradise where she hears that people are happy in heaven, and that sends her off on this desire to wear a chastity and a hair cloth. But we hear about her how she's quite presumptuous in her demands of God, and it's not really until we get to chapter 6 chapter 5 that we have this kind of conversion experience, and this is when she really starts to hear Christ speaking to her, leading her in very much leading her and telling her what she should do, how she should live her life following him. And from that comes these wonderful visionary experiences, which are not like Julian at all. They're absolutely bedded within the imaginative understanding of scripture. The idea that when you read scripture, it's a little bit like St. Ignatius, but it's much more, I suppose it's a bit more free-flowing than Ignatius is, that you hear scripture and then in church, but then you go home and you imagine those scenes for yourself, and you are like a participant within those scenes. Francis of Assisi was very good at this, and of course the Christmas crib is absolutely taken from this understanding of making scripture your own, getting it embedded into your life and understanding. So really, when we get to chapter 9, we're launched off, ready to enter into the book and the rest of her spiritual life that is to come after. So that's my kind of introduction. I will show you the questions that you can ponder. Let me just find the share again. There we go. So there are some questions to ponder, and all of those I hope will be helpful. So it's about, what are your first impressions of this book? How do you engage with this book? Do they resonate with you at all in your own spiritual life? What is this question about writing? Who wrote a text? And what does the nothing of authorship mean in this context? In what ways do you relate to Margery? And to what extent has Margery's account been altered by time and shaped by later significance? What I mean by that is, to what extent is she going back and her memory shaping her account, and then placing it within a wider sphere of understanding? For example, precisely dating her the writing of her book to on the day that Bridget of Sweden died. So that using of significance to give her life significance, but also as a kind of structuring device.